Good afternoon. It's with pleasure that I have von Seidels, Ralph van Niekerk joining me today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I can never do really properly introduce people with all that they have on their long CVs, so I'm going to leave it up to them. And also Sean Willman. If you will introduce yourself, then we can start the conversation.
Thanks, Madeleine. So my name is Ralph van Niekerk. I'm a partner and patent attorney at von Seidels. We are an intellectual property law firm here in Cape Town, and we were a startup once too. I was involved from the beginning about 15 years ago, and we've built the business now. Outside of the Gauteng region, we're the largest IP firm now in South Africa, about 110 people. And my background is on the technical side is electrical engineering and computer science, and then law in South Africa, as well as having had the privilege of doing a master's in law in Silicon Valley at Stanford University about 15 years ago as well.
Oh, fantastic. So Ralph is the right person for this panel today. Thank you, Ralph. Sean, you're an entrepreneur yourself?
My name is Sean Willman. My background is in chemical engineering. I spent about 18 years in the public R&D sector, ending up as the head of technology transfer at the CSIR, which was a very interesting and enjoyable journey, trying to help commercialize African technology and see it become successful commercially. But then the entrepreneurial bug bit me. I got frustrated standing on the sidelines and cheering for other people, so I left the cushy job for zero salary and started a renewable energy technology business in 2014, together with my co-founder, Richard Fearon, and that business is still running. We finally making a little bit of money. We can finally pay ourselves a little bit of salary. And then on the side, a few years ago, I started the Moorman Institute, which is an online learning institute in technology commercialization.
Thank you, Sean. Myself, my name is Madeleine Klein. I am presently the Director of Technology Transfer at Innovis, Stellenbosch University's Technology Transfer Office. I've been in industry. My background is I'm a chemical engineer, like Sean. I'm also a qualified South African patent attorney. I did my PhD in intellectual property commercialization, East meet West, so how do we invest in Eastern companies. I also have my own startup, which is called MadK IP Consulting, which I can advise clients on intellectual property. At Innovis, we have an incubator, which is called the Launch Lab, and part of my job every day is to support startups on how to start a business, developing business plans, protecting their intellectual property, and raising funds. So I think the panel today will be able to answer any questions you may have, and we hope that we will be able to address some of the questions that you've raised and sent through to us beforehand. I think what's very important to understand as a startup is, although you're a small business, it doesn't mean that intellectual property is not something that's out of your reach just because you're small. Intellectual property is very expensive to obtain and maintain, but it's a very important factor to have in your arsenal as a startup, as a small business, because it attracts investors, but it also protects the environment and keeps the competitors out. And I think I'm going to ask Ralph to provide us with some insight on building an intellectual property portfolio as a startup.
So I think you start by thinking about the assets of your business. Now, you have some tangible assets. You probably have computers, desks, chairs, stock on hand. Maybe if you're lucky, you own a building or a plant of some kind. And then you have intangible assets and human capital. Now, your human capital can leave tomorrow. That's not something that's actually owned by your business. So your intangible assets, I'm guessing for most of you, is going to be the biggest component of your business. And within intangible assets, one of the most important categories are so-called intellectual property rights or intellectual property. And intellectual property is anything that the law recognizes as being owned, any intangible that can be owned, licensed, sold, and dealt with in a way that's the same as property. And I'd like to give you 3 examples of intellectual property just to kind of set the scene. 4 actually. The first is a so-called unregistered intellectual property right. This is something that the law gives you automatically, whether you apply for it or not. And the most important category there is copyright. So if you create an original work, and a work could be a piece of software code, it could be a literary work like a book, it could be a musical work, a sound recording, As long as you've reduced it to material form, you as the author or the company that employs you will be the first owner of copyright in that particular work. You don't have to file an application or register anything. With unregistered IP rights like copyright, the most important thing to know is that you have to make sure that you actually own them. So if you are working with outside contractors or outside consultants, have a look at those agreements. They need to include what's called an IP assignment clause, which very simply means that the person signing it says, I hereby acknowledge that all IP I generate belongs to the company I'm doing the work for. This is something I see a lot with startup businesses, is they'll have employed someone, for example, to create a website or to build their software code, but they haven't got the IP assignment clauses. You probably see that as well, Madeleine.
Yeah, we often see, especially with logo designs for startups in the beginning, and being under the impression that because they pay for the service, they also own the deliverable, and the underlying intellectual property own the deliverable. So it's very important to address that in a contract.
Yeah. And then we have what are called registered IP rights. And there are three really important forms of registered IP rights. Patents, you've all heard of. Trademarks, you've all heard of. And then there's something called registered designs. Now, patents protect inventions, new inventions that are capable of being used or applied in trade, industry, agriculture that involve an inventive step. And typically, what these are technological improvements. They can be products, processes, composition of matter. Sean mentioned his company, Power Optimal, and they've actually invented a new technology, a way that you can take a solar panel, which produces direct current, and you can power a geyser, we call them in South Africa, those of you from other countries, water heater, directly with DC without needing to use an inverter and a battery. And that technology is protected by patents. Trademarks are also really important. All of these brands you see behind me here are trademarks, or could be registered as trademarks. This product of Sean's has a great trademark, I think. It's called, he won't mind me saying, the Elon. And we actually debated this.
People don't forget that.
They don't. We actually debated this internally at my firm, and we were saying, is he going to get in trouble? I mean, you don't really take on the world's richest guy and not expect trouble. But we concluded that it was actually a brilliant trademark because that brand hasn't before been used in conjunction with these goods and services. So it was actually available, and I think it's certainly a clever brand that they've come up with. And then the third interesting form of IP rights that are registered are registered designs. If you have a product that has commercial appeal, particularly something that is like a consumer product, you can register a design. And actually here in my pocket, I have a product which was invented here in Cape Town. You might have seen this. It was called Namuno Loops. It's basically Lego tape. And you can cut it up, and it's got a sticky back. And you can build all sorts of Lego structures upside down or against walls. So they launched this product on Indiegogo, hoping to raise $8,000 was their goal. And within 26 days, they'd raised $1.6 million on Indiegogo from 44,000 backers. And of course, then they had to supply the product to all of those backers. But fortunately, we had designs and we could license something. So that was where design applications really came in value for that particular product.
I think the important thing that Ralph is raising is that when you have intellectual property rights, you as the owner of that right is the only one that can license and provide the right for others to use it. It's a negative right, so it excludes others from doing exactly the same, but it gives you that advantage to have something on offer in addition to your services and products by protecting those services and products with a registered right.
I think something else about that is that it's never too early to start thinking about intellectual property. You might think, in your startup it's not important yet, but as Ralph said, if you look at the Standard & Poor top 500 companies, I think it's over 90% of their value now is in intangibles. I mean, we've moved from the industrial economy to a service economy to a knowledge economy, and that means most of what we trade in is intellectual products. So it's highly likely that your business will have your startup will have the same profile. So you have to start thinking about that right from the beginning. And we'll talk a little bit later about how do investors value the startup, and it's a key component of that value. You Because if they start doing a due diligence and they see that you haven't given attention to those things, and small things like you mentioned about having in your subcontractor or your contractor agreements, having clauses that assign the intellectual property explicitly to you. If you haven't done those things, it's quite easy to do it the first time right if you think about it and if you give it attention, but it's very hard to fix it later. So as soon as there's money on the table, people get very hard to negotiate with. So.
And don't do it yourself. There's certain jobs that you have an expert to deal with. If you think you can file your own patent or your own trademark or draft your own contracts to save money, it may cost you dearly later. There's an art in drafting a contract the right way, and lawyers and professionals understand what are the correct clauses to have in those agreements to protect your interest. And there are many attorneys that are available to serve SMEs to help them through the first forming years. I mean, Ralph here is going to be rendering some service tomorrow for any SME who wants some intellectual property advice, but it's definitely something that you have to bear in mind. You're not at this alone. Intellectual property is important. Protect it early. If you're uncertain about the patentability of your invention, keep it confidential. Have the correct confidential agreements. So make sure that if you employ someone in your startup, that you also have agreements with those employees. We'll touch a little bit on the agreement aspects a bit later. You still wanted to talk about some of the rights?
So yeah, those are the major forms of registered rights that I wanted to just address, were patents, trademarks, and designs. One thing I just want to stress as well, for patents and designs, in most countries, you have to file for protection before you disclose. So that's quite important to remember. There are some countries that give what are called a grace period. Like in the United States, you can file for protection up to a year after you've disclosed. But you do actually have to make a decision before you launch your product or before you put it up on your website, whether you're going to be seeking patent or design protection, or whether you're just going to be relying on a trade secret, perhaps if you can, or confidential information.
And remember, confidential information is a very tricky right to protect. It's how you manage that information, how you receive and disclose it, and making sure that that not just the agreement is in place before you speak to any investors or any potential industry partners, but the fact that you have to manage that information and making sure that when you disclose the information that you're undertaking is safe. You often deal with big industry partners which may not want to sign confidentiality agreements. And how do I deal with that?
So to me, and this was actually one of the questions we were prepped with, was some of you had asked, is it worth signing non-disclosure agreements? Is it worth the paper it's written on? I think the unanimous answer from this panel would be absolutely. And the two important reasons for that. The first is it clarifies that the disclosure is a confidential one, which, as I mentioned, is very important if you still want to consider, for example, patent protection. But secondly, it gives you a contractual remedy that you didn't otherwise have. If the person who receives the information discloses it, uses it in a non-permitted purpose, you would have a contractual remedy to sue them for breach of contract. Whereas without an NDA, you actually have no remedy because ideas are free. Most companies are willing to sign them. I do sometimes have clients who say, I really want to do business with this company. They're not willing to sign an NDA. What do you recommend? In that case, I think you do have to decide whether or not the opportunity is still worth pursuing. If it is, you can at least send an email in advance of your meeting. Say to the prospect, this is going to be a confidential disclosure. Please remember not to use the information for any purpose except considering this opportunity. And then there is at least a tacit agreement as to confidentiality, which can be useful.
Another challenge we often see with startups is when you start with your best friend, your business, and your best friend is poached by the industry partner and goes with all your trade secrets and confidential information out of the door. So it's very important that when you employ someone into your business, that it is somebody that's trustworthy and that you have tied up with non-competes and confidential obligations. Although those agreements can be watertight, sometimes it's still the ethics you have to rely on the other side. So have you experienced anything like that, Sean, with someone walking out of a business that you've trained?
Luckily not our startup so far. And I think in the earlier discussion, the ScarabTech startup one of them said that, life is too short to work with people. I think you work with people that you don't want to work with.
They had
And
a
I mean-
different word they used there.
I think that's a very good place to start. And people make, it's very important to have co-founders, I think, because startups can get very lonely. But on the other hand, the wrong co-founders is one of the biggest causes of failure of early stage companies. So we've been lucky so far because we a group of people that enjoy working with each other. But I mean, I've heard lots of horror stories of people that can't believe that the other person has turned out like that. There's a very high rate of fraud and all sorts of unfortunate happenings. So you do need to spend a bit of time making sure that the people you want to work with are really the people that you know them.
Yes, and that they add value to the business. I think it would be interesting for the delegates here to understand the difference between costing and obtaining intellectual property rights protection, and then sort of leading on to the value of intellectual property specifically for a startup and how we do that. So we can start with you, Ralph. Do you think it's worthwhile to spend money in filing patent protection or design protection, and how broadly do I file it? What kind of strategy do I need to follow as a startup?
So typically your registered IP rights are fairly cheap initially and become more expensive as you expand into other countries. So with patents, you can file a first application locally in your home country, and then within 12 months, you can file something else called a PCT, a Patent Cooperation Treaty, which gives you an application, which gives you another 18 months. So you can get a 2.5-year period with just those two applications and still have the right to protect in all the member states of the PCT, which is like 148 member countries. So once you file ultimately in the US and Europe and China and Asia, etc., then you're going to be potentially devoting quite a lot of resources to that. But by that stage, the IP should have justified or should justify the expense. So one of the most frequent queries I do get is, isn't this enormously expensive? And the answer is it can be ultimately, but by then the IP will be worth it, and of course you're not committed to any of those costs. You can start off relatively inexpensively in your home country with IP protection. But you do have to eventually, and this is another myth that does the round, there's no such thing as a worldwide patent or a worldwide trademark, but there are conventions that extend the deadlines for filing in other countries. And I think that's where the confusion comes in. Ultimately, though, if you want to get rights in Argentina, you're going to have to file for protection there, but not right away.
Thank you. We'll talk a little bit about offshore structures, I think after valuation, because I want to give you some time to address the value.
Okay.
Do you think there's value in an early startup for intellectual property, and how do you value an early startup?
Yeah, I think that's, as you know, that's the topic of a multi-day course. But so try
Join
to
us
be
in November.
try to be very brief about it. We said earlier that most companies now, the bulk of their value lies in their intangibles. And as Ralph said, intellectual property is really to do with setting a claim or a boundary around a set of ideas and knowledge and information and insight, and drawing a line around it and saying, this is my property. And once it is your property, you have the ability to trade in that property, and that creates value. So that's why intellectual property in the startup context creates value for the startup. But usually also, because if you think about most startups are built around, say, either a new technology or invention or a new business model, perhaps. And even with a new business model, there will be trade secrets and there will be other intangibles, things like that you build over time, things like customer relationships, your customer database. Maybe you have exclusive partnerships with specific other companies, and all of those things, that basket of intangibles is creating value in the business. And that's the same that investors will look at. When investors look at a young company and they say, what is the value of this company, and you have to get into those negotiations. Of course, in many cases, you don't even have any revenue yet. So if you've got a well-established business, you can look at the historical financials and how they've changed over time, and you can look at the specific market or industry they operate in, and you can make guesses or estimates and forecasts about how that market and industry will grow in the future and what the market share of that company will be, and that will give you a relatively good basis from a financial perspective to make projections into the future that you can use to value that company. But if you're a startup and you're at a very early stage, maybe you've got revenue, maybe you've got none. How do you get to value? And the thing is, from an investor perspective, there are things that they will look at, but they look at those for good reason. It's not just because that's what investors do. It's because those are the things that create value. And if you look at pre-revenue, there's a set of, when you look at a startup company or a young company, really from a financial perspective, the only thing that has value is the future revenue generating potential. That is it. That's what, if an investor puts money in the business, it's because that's what they see. Of course, they might also be doing it because they have a passion for what you're trying to achieve. But even from that perspective, it's highly likely that your objective will be to grow as fast and as big as possible, because if you're trying to make a big impact in the world, the bigger you are, the bigger the impact. So when we look at the early stage company in terms of value, on the one hand, you will have the value, the things that you do that create value for the business, and on the other side, you will have the risks. And of course, the earlier you are, the more risks there are, the more things you still have to prove. And those risks are in many dimensions. They include, for example, technical risks, things that you might not be aware of for your product or service that you plan to offer that you're going to discover later. Manufacturability, scaling. You have commercial risks, you have market risks that the market segment that you're targeting might disappear, or they might, you have competitor risk, all these sort of different dimensions. Legal risk, risk related to your intellectual property. So when investors look at your company, they're going to do a due diligence. They're going to look at those several risk factors and see how are you planning to mitigate those risk factors, or what things do you already have in place that are mitigating those risk factors. And a useful way to think about it is to talk about value inflection points. The idea is that in the early stage company, when you're raising investment, you need to raise enough money in that investment round to get you to a value inflection point. In other words, some or other milestone that definitively reduces one or more of those risks that we're talking about, or proves a certain component of your value proposition, so that your startup's value has a step change, a step increase. Because otherwise, if you run out of money before you've achieved that value inflection, the next value inflection point, that means that you're gonna get maybe even what's so-called down round. You're gonna get a poorer valuation than the previous round, and all the existing investors will be very unhappy with you. You will also be unhappy because you're also losing value. Plus, now you have to get new investors on board and convince them that this time your promises are gonna come true. Because if you don't get to that milestone, it means you didn't achieve what you set out or promised to do in the previous round, and that means you lose credibility as well. But so those sorts of value inflection points that I'm talking about are things like product market fit, achieving the first sale, proving that the product or service can be delivered at scale, proving that non-founders can sell the product or service, because sometimes it's only the founders that are so passionate and that understand the product or service well enough that they manage to achieve a sale. And if you want to scale the business, you have to show that you can disengage the founders from the sales process. So I think I'll stop there, because I think I've already said way too much, but okay. Can say a lot more about it.
Maybe I can ask you, Ralph, now, with understanding that there is possibility to build value in a startup. Often as an African company or African startup, the suggestion is, let's create some dollars or euro wealth. Do you think it's worthwhile for a startup to establish a company offshore? At what time, if at all? And what are the challenges and risks with that?
Yeah, that's also a big topic, Madeleine, but I think there's certainly a lot of interest for South Africa, and I imagine other African startups, to want to move value offshore, or at least move IP potentially offshore, so that you can earn some of your revenue in harder currencies, perhaps de-risk your business from certain local factors. So the stats are that 1 out of 10 startups are successful after 3 years. Is that right, Sean? Or is it after 5? Something like that.
Yeah, I think it might even be less.
It might be less. So I think the first thing is you want to be sure that you're one of those 1 out of 10 before you go to the expense, cost, complexity of setting up an international structure, because it is a distraction from what you are doing at the moment, which is trying to get your business viable and going. So I would say, in answer to the question, is it worthwhile? A lot depends on where you are in the phase of your business. Some businesses have international investors or international partners from the outset, and it might be easier in that situation to incorporate offshore and drive IP development from offshore. I think the other thing that's really important to understand is it isn't just a question of purchasing a shelf company in Delaware and then setting up an agreement and pretending that all the IP is owned from there. These days, with OECD guidelines and compliance between jurisdictions, you really have to have substance in the country in which your IP development is happening. Otherwise, you've just got what's called a controlled foreign company, and all of that revenue will in any case be deemed as revenue within the business in your home country. So it's also a question that depends a lot on tax law, for which you'll need specialist advice, because you want to be looking at things like whether the country in which you're proposing to incorporate has double taxation agreements with the countries where you're going to be making sales. So I think the message I want to get across is, yes, it may well be worthwhile for your business, but you need to be at a certain level of maturity where you can devote the resources, time, energy, and potentially get the people in place that you'll need in that jurisdiction to make the whole structure work legally and practically.
Yeah, and the tax compliance can be quite complex, specifically with transfer pricing when you have interrelated entities, which could be quite daunting if you don't even understand the basic principles of the tax legislation in the country. You also have the intercompany matters that's there. So I'm going to do some closing remarks, and we're going to have 2 minutes, I think, for questions if there are any from the floor. Do you want to wrap up? Give us a go-away message.
Well, I think just as Madeleine said right at the beginning, IP isn't just for big companies. I think relative to the value for startups, it's actually a lot more valuable, because big companies have other advantages, networks, assets that you don't. So your IP is a very precious asset, and it's something you should think about at this stage of your business cycle.
And so,
I want to link up to that and say, it's a way to crystallize the value in the early stage business, but also you might think that, of course, you don't have the financial resources to enforce it when you're a small company. But the point is that you're creating those intangible assets that create the value for you to later exit to a bigger business, or if you become big, you will have the money to enforce it. So it's one of the things that is a key value creator in a small business.
and I think just from my side, the one thing that I've seen in the startups that I worked with, and Sean is also an example of that, is sometimes you set yourself out to do a specific business. You have specific intellectual property to drive that business. And somewhere along the way, you realize I'm never going to get there. Or it's the regulatory requirements and approvals are so long-winding, I'm never going to get there. Just change direction. Find something else to do, like Sean did with his educational systems on the side until the business was going. So don't give up. Never give up. It's always worth it. Thank you very much. Any questions?
I've got a question.
Who's I?
David,
Hi, David.
I'm glad this mic is on. Okay, so my question is, how do you generate trust and integrity in an environment of corruption where, I've personally experienced friends stealing from me. So this is the issue that I have, especially as I start my 4th startup, and I don't want to experience the same mistakes again.
Are you talking about corruption within your midst or within the government?
Well, every government is corrupt, so I'm not worried about that.
Within your own
I'm more
company.
concerned about the people that I'm interacting with, the people that I'm working with, subcontractors, and really especially when you go to an investment bank and they steal your idea from you. So that, you can have an NDA with them, but you can't enforce it until you're a billion-dollar company like they are. So, I understand that you need to have the agreements and they're important, but I myself have spent way too much on trademarks that I never needed. So I'm not suggesting people don't do that, but my particular question is how to create trust and integrity. I try to tell everybody I work with that if you look at Microsoft or Facebook or IBM or any of these companies, the founders are all there. And maybe people are making movies about them, but the founders are still there. And they work through their problems together. How do we make that happen in South Africa and Africa?
I'm going to ask Ralph to give you the legal answer, but I'm going to give you another answer. You shouldn't trust anyone that you deal with, and you should never tell them everything that you know. the secret of being successful and trusting the people you work with is to never give them everything, so there's something more that they need or want before they can continue without you. That is my little bit of advice, but on the legal side, I'm going to leave that one for you, Rob. You want to be the lawyer.
What does the American government say? Trust but verify. So, I mean, yeah, I think it's a good point, Madeleine. If you are, for example, disclosing information to a big company, you might not disclose everything. You might ask them for, certain counter performance on their part, maybe that they, give you particular commitments or buy the first product or service from you or something like that. But yeah, legally, of course, the best you can do in a situation like that is to have a good NDA, which does give you a contractual remedy. Trade secret theft is actually in some countries, and Madeleine can talk to this, not simply a civil wrong, which means it's something you have to sue someone else for, but it can even elevate to the level of a crime. So in some cases of corporate espionage, you can even report those kinds of things to authorities and have them investigate. I mean, in South Africa, it's not really the same, but we have, for example, the Competition Commission, which will investigate anti-competitive practices by companies, where, for example, if there is someone that you're dealing with and you notice that they're doing things like price fixing or tying arrangements, you can actually report that to the Competition Commission to investigate. So I think there are legal avenues at your disposal, and yeah, it's probably a combination of legal remedies as well as some of these other things.
Keep your hands closed.
I want to say, but there's also the human factor, of course, and that gets back to what we said about working with people that you want to work with. It's about shared value systems, and I mean, that's not something that can be taught, really. You have to be your own judge of that, and sometimes you'll be wrong, but sometimes you'll be right, and then it'll be rewarding. It's the same as with relationships.
Yeah,
If you don't go out there, you're not going to
get it, but one thing is never be desperate, because people see it on your face, and that's when they take your stuff, because you can't do anything about it. Desperation is not good. Our time's up. I don't know if we're allowed one more question, or are we out of here?
The powers that be have said no.
Okay.
Well,
thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.
I must say to Rolf, to Sean, Professor, thank you very much for your time. You know, the tech ecosystem, as it's matured, it is an ecosystem. And while a lot of the tech startups are in the glitz and the glamour and the spotlight, it can't thrive without the support from the universities, the lawyers like yourself, the experts like yourself, Sean. And I really want to thank you for taking time, and from Van Seidel's point of view, for taking time tomorrow to spend with the startups. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.